Hey everybody, in our last video we showed everyone the hardware setup for our ECUMasters to Honda Beat setup. So I said I'd make another video on basically on how the software operates. So basically here we have the software open. No file is loaded, so there's nothing going on down here if you can follow the mouse. So unfortunately I don't have a car here today that I can hook up to demonstrate everything, but I'm going to just work through the software so everyone can kind of get an idea of it. So we're going to open up our file and we're going to do the Honda Beat stock injector, stock coil, stock distributor base map. Okay, so we're going to load that up. This warning here is not a big deal. So with different firmwares, they release like newer software features and stuff like that, and it's just saying that, hey, you know, the firmware on this does not match the file, which again, not a big deal. All we got to do is just click OK down here or exit out, and then we can set it up later. So so let's go over this really quick here. So in our instruction manual, we talk about setting up the TPS as one of them. If you look over here on the left hand side, we're going to go to sensor setup, we're going to go to TPS, and that's how we set up our minimum max. Now, people wonder, okay, where do you get the values from? There's two places you can get them from. So on the left here, if you go down to log, you can click on analog inputs, and you can see your TPS voltage here. So you would set, without depressing the throttle, so your foot's off the throttle, you'll set the minimum, then you'll go wide open throttle, and then you'll set the maximum. Now, why is this important? There's two reasons why this is important. The first one is actually in engine start. So engine start here, if you look here, oops, maybe I'm wrong. Oh, here it is. So in fuel TPS scale here, this is when the car's cranking. So let's just say that you're setting up injectors that don't come with our base map and the car floods out, right? You can essentially look here, down here, this is the percentage. If you hold 100% throttle, it'll actually turn the injectors completely off. So basically to flood clear it. So that's pretty useful there, but that's one reason. The second reason why this is important is down here in our enrichments. Oops. There we go. So this is our enrichment table here, accelerated enrichment. So what this is doing is that when you're at a dead stop and you're off the throttle, then you go to nail it. It needs the TPS to know how fast it should add fuel accordingly. And we have, if you look here on the left hand side, there's basically 4 tables that have to deal with that. We'll go over this just really quickly here, but basically if you look down here, this is percentage again, and this is the TPS percentage. If you stab the throttle extremely hard, extremely quickly, it's going to add 24% of the fuel table to it. Now, people are like, okay, well, this says down here, this says 124. That doesn't make sense. It should be adding 124. No. The way the software works is that if you have 100, then that means that there's 100% of the fuel table. If you're above 100, it's adding 24% of the table. And again, same deal if you're less than. So if you're less than 100, that means that when you first have the throttle, it's subtracting 60% throttle. Now, this is not typical on most cars. The only reason why this is on the Beat is only because it has the ITBs, as we all know. Generally speaking, the way on a normal car, the way it would look is something along the lines of this. This is extremely linear, but this is essentially how it would start. But you know, on a non-ITB car, you know, there's only one throttle, so you barely tap the throttle, and you're getting a little bit of air in. But as you guys already know, with ITBs, when we tap the throttle, because they all have their own throttles, it's actually pulling a ton more air. So you actually have to lean it out just a smidge. But that's just one table, one of the many. There's this table, this table, and this table. And this all has to do with the accelerant enrichment. So as you can see, it is kind of complicated, but fortunately enough, the base map will get that set up for you where you don't have to worry about it. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of everything. Firstly, let's just say that we are not using this on a Beat. So in your fueling general over here, this is just the general setup of the engine. So for the Beat, you know, we know it's a 660cc. We're using alpha N with map multiplier, and I'll get to that in a second. Our fueling strategy is the basic AFR, and these are 240cc injectors stock. Okay, so nothing's crazy there. Now, some of you may know what alpha N and what alpha N isn't. If alpha N is actually really different in comparison to other cars. Most cars are speed density. So if you look here, down here, this is RPM, and this is actually throttle position, if you can see it here. Most cars actually use map sensors. So this is like what we would be seeing would be vacuum here and say boost up here. That's what this normally looks like. But since it's ITB, we use alpha N. Because we're using alpha N plus map multiplication, this is the table here. So what map multiplication is, if you look here, we've got throttle position down here and map load here, okay? And this would be coming from the map sensor on the ECU. On a boosted application that's alpha N, for instance, Turbo Beats or R32, or any legacy GTR would be using this. So essentially, it's looking at this main fuel table down here, and it would be adding or removing fuel based off of this table. So again, this is 100% of this fuel table. So if it's boosted, right, it would actually look something, I don't know, something along the lines of like this. Probably not necessarily like that. Let's see if we can at least change it up so it looks halfway decent. I don't want to get laughed at online here. Alrighty, so essentially it would look something like this. So it's hard to understand, especially if you're someone in the US, but 100% here on map is actually atmospheric pressure. It would be basically the 0 on the boost gauge, if you will. So if we're adding, this is 110 map, so it's like half a PSI roughly. This would be adding 25% on top of this fuel table, depending on where it's at. So it's a little confusing, but hopefully that makes a lot of sense. And if it doesn't, let me know, and I'll try to further explain that. But that's essentially how that works. Obviously, this is an NA Beat, so we're not doing any of this stuff here. So we'll close that out. Yeah. Ignition is handled a little bit differently. So whereas our fuel table is RPM versus TPS, on the ignition table, it's actually completely different. So this is our ignition table. And basically, it's run off of RPM and vacuum load here. So because this is actually simpler to do, it's a little bit more confusing, especially if you've never done tuning before. But if you have done some tuning before, this will make a lot more sense to you. It's just your standard setup. So if you look over here at the 3D table, you'll see that there's this massive drop-off right about here, okay? Why is that? So remember, on a naturally aspirated car, wide open throttle, we should see about 100 kPa, right? On an ITB car, it is possible to see a hair over 100 kPa, and I think on the Beats, I think we were like 105-ish kPa, so that's why this is it right here. Now, believe it or not, with this base map here, 29 degrees sounds like a lot. It actually is quite little. We actually turned it up. I think, don't quote me on this, but on my own particular car, I think I was actually closer to 40 up here, but we weren't yielding any more power. So running 40 degrees of timing up here and 29 degrees of timing, we basically saw virtually no change in power. So there's no point to run ignition timing, obviously, if we're not making any more power. So, and this is a pretty safe value here. I think, I believe on Kai's car, I want to say, he is actually closer to 31-ish here. but don't quote me on that. But this is basically it here. The beauty about the EMU though, as you can see, this table is extremely large. So if you do decide to boost your beat, look at the resolution that you have here for boosted cells. So anything above 100 is boost. Look at that. That's all boost ignition table right there. And you can scale this as well. So if you don't ever see yourself running 28 pounds of boost, we can easily scale this. We just right click it and we will hit the, right click it and hit the Y value, and you can interpolate it. So let's just say that the car idles, I don't know, 40 kPa, and it's seeing 110 kPa max. We hit that, and look at that. Not only did it rescale the table, it's actually rescaled the ignition table correctly as well too. So you're obviously going to need a little bit of work and a little bit of human stuff into this just to make sure that everything is right, but it essentially will interpolate it correctly for you. So go back to that. So the next step is that we do have ignition correction based off of coolant temp and intake air temp. So we'll open that up here. FM. So I haven't found an actual usefulness, as far as the beat goes anyways, for ignition versus CLT. On cars that have like cast iron blocks, Nissan SR20, 2J, KA24, etc., this is a little bit more useful because the cars, with cast iron, as it gets hot, it stays hot. So this is a little bit more useful. On the beat, I haven't found an actual use for it. And intake air temps, you can see it here. And as we basically approach 80 Celsius, it starts to remove 1 degree of timing, right? And then all the way up to 110 Celsius, then we remove 4 degrees of timing. So nothing special there. Now, knock sensors, as I said in my last video, the cars do not come with knock sensors. We can add one. This base map doesn't cover one. But you can actually do math and figure this out. There's actually a really simple formula here. And it's actually in here. So this is probably the only time that you've dealt with pi outside of high school. But yeah, this is the formula here. So if you do this magic formula here, it gives you the value for the frequency. And then you just essentially play, at that point you play with the gain and integer. Okay. And then, once you set knock sensor up, you can set up when it's active. So this is just your base values, obviously, but you can set this up to your liking. But again, most beats aren't really going to need this. All right. So the next step that I want to go through is troubleshooting. I talked about how the ECU itself will do a lot of future proofing for you. So I wanted to go over a couple things. So we can go analog inputs. Fueling. Alright, so this is your analog inputs. These are generic, and then obviously this is TPS. This is CAN analog. We're not using that, but if you do add CAN bus down the line, you can actually have more sensors in, and that's where these 4 come from. So we're going to take a look at what these analog inputs are. So we go to Tools up here, and we show what our assigned inputs are. Alright, so on our base map, the only other input we have, as you can see, none of these are assigned, they're not doing anything. The only input we have is actually for the AC clutch down here. That's analog 3. So if you aren't sure if your AC is kicking over because of the switch, like the control panel is no good, you can actually hit the button and it should change your values here. And it'll be done real time. So, and if you add oil pressure, oil temp, whatever, all that's actually going to be in here as well. So, we have the fueling tab open. So let's just say that you get one of these EMUs and the car does something really funky and you don't know why, right? This actually will tell us all of our fueling, and then I'll go ahead and I'll open this fella here. This is ignition. And you can actually, once you have a log open, you can actually just scroll over the log and it'll show you the current values in each of these tabs, right? So that moves on to something here that I should have mentioned first, but I didn't, is this. This is the graph log. If you look on the left-hand side, it's going from log to graph. And once you double click that, actually this doesn't even have to be open, believe it or not. If you plug the ECU in with the key on, it will immediately start logging. The beauty about this ECU versus other ECUs is that even though we only have a handful of values here, it actually records every value. So, you know, ignition, right? You see how all that changed? Then we can do boost, for instance. See? And you can, you don't have to stick to these. You know, you can actually customize these pretty easily by going to this left button here, clicking on that, and then changing it to whatever you want it to be. And it's always recording. So I tell people all the time, you know, if you get a tune done and the car's acting really funny randomly and you don't know why, plug in your laptop, go for a drive. And if you can't figure out why it's doing it, leave it plugged in until you can get it to do it. And then the moment that you get it to do it, unplug the USB. It'll stop recording, and me or your tuner or whoever else, or even yourself, really, can go through and look at the log to see what's happening, right? So, and that's the usefulness of it. So let's just say that we have, let's just say that we think our TPS is going bad. Same deal. We're going to go open one of these analog inputs here, and we'll look at TPS voltage and see what it's doing. Let's say that we think maybe the cam position sensor on the valve cover is going bad. We can open up ignition, and bam, look at that. Cam signal present. So if you think the cam sensor is going bad or the wiring to it is going bad, it'll actually show up, right? If you think the distributor is going bad, same deal. If you look down here, trigger error, that tells you, and it'll actually give you a warning on, hey, you know, this is a problem here. You know, you should look into it. So if you're unsure about it as well, this beauty down here, you see it says executed sparks count. That actually means how many times the ECU's told the coil to fire, right? So if you start to crank the car and it doesn't start, you can look down here and see if the ECU actually gave out spark. Let's just say it does not give out spark. Then there's a good chance that you have an issue with the cam sensor or the crank sensor, you know, the distributor or the cam sensor and the valve cover. Let's just say that the car does not start, but it gives executed spark count. Then at that point, you've already ruled out the distributor and the cam sensor. You can actually move on to the actual coil itself, distributor cap, wire, whatever. Now, another thing about future proofing. Look at this bad boy. In our tools, we can show our outputs. This is red because they're sharing, and I'll get to that in a second. But you can see everything where everything's wired. So aux3 here is the AC clutch. aux5 is our fuel pump / main relay. Our injectors 1, 2, 3, our idle, and our ignition coil, right? So car's acting funny, you can't figure it out, you don't know why. All you got to do is key it on, right? Once you key it on, you can actually test your outputs here. You think an injector's stuck? Well, that's simple. Go to your output, go to injector 1, hit test. It'll run the test 10 times. It'll cycle it on and off during this duration, right? So you should hear an audible click, 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 you know, and then move on to the next one. Bam. All right. You think your fuel pump is going bad. All right. So let's check and see. So if we look at our outputs here, we know the fuel pump is aux5. We can go to tools, test output, go to aux5, and click it. Now you would want this a little bit longer because it's a fuel pump, right? But this is enough to hear a relay clicking. Another way you can actually test this as well is we're going to go to outputs here. We're going to go to fuel pump. And if you invert this right here, you just simply click that on, it'll force the fuel pump on without the engine running. And you should at that point be able to check it. So if you need to check fuel pressure, if you need to check the main relay, whatever, you can actually just check it this way. In my earlier videos, I talked about your tacho output and your speedometer output. So on our base map, it's not wired. If you want me to wire it up, I'm more than happy to, right? You can actually change this. So one thing that I mentioned before was that if you want your stock speedometer to work, but you want it to read mile per hour, all you have to do is change this multiplier. You know, so I believe you change it to 1.6, and that'll immediately cause it to read in mile per hour. Pretty damn close to it anyways. Same thing with tach. If your tach is a little bit on the lazy side, you know, like, and we all know that the Beat gauge cluster is really wonky, but you know, sometimes and a lot of cars, S13s especially now, sometimes, man, they just don't work as well as they should, and you can slightly up the multiplier, 1.1, 1.5, whatever. If you do a swap, right, we know that the RPM signals are going to be way different from a 3-cylinder, 4-cylinder. You can actually change that here and get the stock tach working, right? So there's that. So in our manual, we do talk about idle control a little bit. So every idle valves, they're a little bit different from one another. Some work well, some don't. But this idle reference table here is direct control of the idle control valve. So if the values go up, like this, idle goes up. If you bring them down, the idle goes down. So you do have to do a little bit of playing with the idle screw to get it right, because you want it to idle. You want it to idle well without having the idle valve doing any real work. So the idle valve we usually will use in the sense of like AC compressor, power steering, you know, when you full lock the wheel at a complete dead stop, you know, those types of things. That's really what you want this for. But you can fine tune it here. So we don't have the fans running on the Beat. The way the Beat's set up is that it has its own specific sensor for the fans to come on. But let's just say that you did want to wire the fans up to the ECU. It's definitely all doable, and we're able to adjust it here at certain temperatures. So you want it to come on at, I don't know, 80 Celsius. You just hit that sucker right there. And this hysteresis value means that it would basically come on anywhere from 79 to 81 Celsius is kind of where it would come on. Now, if you have the ECU controlling the fans, you can actually have it turn off while you're cranking. So that way you're not just draining the battery for whatever reason. You can have it turn off with no RPMs. You can have it turn on with AC, which you should. And if your coolant temperature sensor fails, it will, and the ECU realizes it, it'll actually kick the fan over for you. So lots of cool stuff there. Oh, earlier we talked about this right here. So aux2 is your check engine light. So it's actually the cat heat light. It's on the left hand side. It's like a little rectangle thing that turns red. And shift output. So if one of your sensors fail, it's going to illuminate that light. But secondly, it also doubles as your shift light. So I touched up a little bit on the if your tachometer goes bad, and the shift light is kind of useful. So it's pretty simple here. That's not it. I lied. Check engine. So basically, with the check engine light, if any of these sensors fail, the wideband, the IAT, the coolant temp, or the map, that check engine light will come on. Now, the shift light function is a little bit different. So basically, this light will also come on at 8700 or whatever you actually program it to. If 87 is not is too high for you, you shift a little bit on the slower side, then you can adjust this to your liking, right? So yeah, there's definitely that, and we can also, if you're looking for fuel economy instead, you can actually do this by gear, and we have gear figured out thanks to Kai actually. So you can actually set this up per gear as like a shift up light, if you will. So there's that. We have a bunch of other cool fun stuff: launch control, flat foot shift. Flat foot shift does require a clutch switch. It's not active by default on our base map, but it's as simple as wiring it up, picking one of these, and bam, that sucker is working. Okay. Launch control, on the other hand, is always working because the ECU knows the speed. So long as the speed is below 5 kilometers an hour, it's going to hit our launch control at 59 to 6,000. It'll actually cut off at 6,000 RPMs, right? And again, same deal. This is all user adjustable. Now, that basically covers everything as far as the Beat goes, but I wanted to kind of touch up on a couple of things here as far as increased functionality. Obviously, we have flex fuel here. Okay, not everyone's going to use flex fuel, but like I wanted to show you guys before, is that this blend function here, we actually have control of all the blending, right? So this says that if it's this says here that if it's 100% 93, so E0, then it's going to use all of map 1. And the inverse is true. If it's E90 down here, then it's going to run nothing from the main fuel table. So, to put that in perspective, if you look down here, this is our first fuel table, this is VE1, and this is VE2, right? Since flex fuel is not enabled, this is just like your dummy map. It doesn't do anything, okay? But that's how that works. There's two separate tables, and it automatically does the blending live, right? So there's no, there's nothing that you have to do. There's no playing around with it, no flipping switches, no changing tunes, none of that. Once you have the flex fuel sensor in, and this is calibrated correctly, then it's going to work magically, okay? All right. Down here we have this. This is a custom correction. This is actually any correction that you want to make up. So if there's something that the ECU does not have, like for instance oil temp, if you add an oil temp sensor and you wanted to retard timing, you can all set that up here. Again, that doesn't really apply to the Beat, but it's definitely there. Let's talk about some of the fail-safe stuff here. Oil pressure cut. So if you have oil pressure and we set it all up and it's enabled, let's just say that you do not have oil. You forgot to put oil in it. You lost the drain plug. I don't know. Whatever. You run out of oil pressure, right? So after 5 seconds, cranking the car, that is, like you crank the car up and it fires, you have 5 seconds for it to hit oil pressure. And then if it does not, after another 5 seconds, the car will just die. We set that all up here based off of this table. Boop. And we set up our oil pressure based off of this RPM. And then we're able to set how much, pressure it should be seeing roughly. Okay? And so if it doesn't see pressure, it'll enter limp mode. EGT alarm. Nobody has EGT, but if you decide to do it, it's definitely here. So there's two EGT channels built into the ECU, and you can basically have an alarm, and it'll do whatever you want it to do. Whether you just light up a light or whatever, or you want to activate some other system, it's definitely here. So EGT alarm, for instance, right? EGT's exhaust gas temp, let's just say it gets too high, right? You can actually run a separate fuel pump off of one of these auxiliary outputs rather, and it'll trigger a fuel pump, and then it'll start dumping fuel into the exhaust. Obviously that's not going to be, there's going to be a little bit of messing around with that, but essentially that's what you could do. Or you could wire up a buzzer or a light. It's pretty simple stuff. This is stuck throttle. That's for drive-by-wire stuff. I don't think we really need to talk about that. We've got some timers here. So the timers are kind of a weird one. You would use a timer basically like if you're running some type of nitrous or water methanol, but it's only temporary. So like for instance, if you're seeing knock at 5500, so you got water meth to help reduce that knock, that's basically what this timer is. Not a really smart way of doing it. There's actually far better ways of handling that in the software, but that's the cheap and easy way of doing it. Traction control. Bam. Traction control requires your front and rear speed sensor, and it basically will look at the difference between the two and adjust accordingly, right? So let's just say that there's a variance of 50%, meaning that your front wheel is reading 50 miles an hour, but the rear wheels are reading 100 miles an hour. It knows for a fact that you have wheel slip, and it will reduce the torque based off of this table, how far off it is. So again, I have the only guys that I actually set up traction control for are actually like high horsepower TJ guys. So again, that's not something that I don't think most of us are doing. But if the day does happen, it is definitely there. We'll go over drive-by-wire. Drive-by-wire is pretty simple. Again, on the EMU Classic, it needs an external module. On the Black, it has it built in. But not really much going on here. Boost, everybody wants to see boost, right? So boost has a couple different scales. This is your boost target. It's set up in the base map, obviously, but it doesn't do anything because it's not boosted. So this is essentially your target. It's looking, this 50 kPa here is 7 pounds of boost roughly. So the ECU knows what you should be targeting. This is direct control of the wastegate. Adding, or not wastegate, the boost controller. Adding more here runs more boost over wastegate spring. Running 0 here is basically wastegate spring. Then we have scale. So if you're doing boost by gear, you can set the scale up for here. And then you can also set it here based off of speed. You have it for IAT and you have it for EGT. Same deal. You know, if it starts to run cool, you'll start to spike a little bit. You can actually reduce it here based off of temperature. And then as it gets hotter, you can reduce boost for safety. EGT no different. If you have an EGT set up and it's definitely getting way too hot, it can reduce the boost here all on its own. And another thing too, just like I said earlier about the fuel tables and inertia tables as far as flex fuel goes, you have two separate tables and they blend between the two. So, you know, let's just say that this is max effort, all of it, right? And you're in between your ethanol blends, it'll actually blend between these two live. So again, you know, no messing around, no hitting anything weird. All right. So I think I basically covered everything that needs to be covered as far as the EMU goes in reference to the Beat. And as you can see that even this is their quote unquote basic ECU here, you can see that this ECU is like full of features. I can't tell you how many customers I have running EMUs or EMU blacks, and believe it or not, I have a handful of customers that have two different cars running on the same ECU, and so they actually will switch the ECUs between their cars, and then load up whatever base map they need to load up, and then they go. You know, there's no point to have two ECUs because you as a person cannot drive two cars at the same time. If you're able to do so, let me know because I'd love to see it. But again, it's a very powerful ECU. It is a bit overkill for the Beat, but the way I see it is you future-proof the car so much that it's almost stupid not to do it. Yes, it is expensive, I agree. But if you love your Beat enough, you know, you're going to spend the money on this, and as you can see, you're going to grow with this ECU. No matter what you end up doing with your Beat, it's always going to be here. And the best part about it, like I said, you can move this to a different car. Who knows? You build an S chassis car or you import a R32 in. You know, this ECU is going to work on that car just well. You know, so there's not going to be any problems there, and you really get a really good bang for buck for it. It's hard to beat. The base price of the ECU itself is only $900. There's no ECU on the market that is this feature packed for that value. Some people will argue like, oh, well, you can buy an MS2 and it'll do the same thing, and that's where they're wrong. MS2 does not have two full tables for flex fuel. It does not have an onboard wideband. It does not have onboard EGTs. So again, if you watched the earlier video, you know what I mean by onboard. I mean that the capability is there. You have to add the sensor for it. So, but hopefully this covers everything for you guys. If you have any other questions, feel free again to reach out to me and let me know. Again, you know, if you're looking to purchase one, reach out to me directly, and then we'll get you all set up on one.